Hello, the topic of my presentation is what is a spiritual exemplar, not what I expected. And I'd like to tell you about a part of my research that yielded results that I didn't expect and that are much more interesting, I think, than the results I did expect. My research is called Living Transcendence, a phenomenological study of spiritual exemplars. And I'll start with the term spiritual exemplars. Exemplars are people who are highly developed on a particular construct, and that construct can be morality, courage, goodness, creativity, or scholarly excellence. These are some well-known spiritual exemplars. Had they been boxing exemplars, for example, I would have put these pictures. Now, is there someone whom you consider an exemplar in any field or area of life? Think about it for a second, just so that it would give you a flavor of what an exemplar means. In the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about a very tiny part of the research of living transcendence, which is the methodological part of it. One of the methodologies used in the study is the exemplar methodology, defined as a study of participants who are highly developed on a particular construct, and in this case, spirituality. Within this methodology, I'm going to focus on the approach to nominating exemplars, which is the very first question researchers ask when using this methodology. And within the process of exemplar nomination, I'm going to focus on exemplar recognition, which is the hardly ever spoken about backstage mechanics of how exemplars are actually really nominated. This is where I had an interesting insight, which I'd like to share with you. Previous researchers using the exemplar methodology focused mainly on moral exemplars. And the most well-known study of moral exemplars was done by Anne Colby and William Damon and published in 1992 in a book called Some Do Care. The nomination approach that Colby and Damon used was based on selecting a group of 20 experts, people who reflect systematically about moral ideas as part of their professions, who formulated criteria for moral exemplars and then used those criteria to nominate such exemplars. The criteria developed and defined by the group of experts were a sustained commitment to moral ideals or principles, a sustained evidence of moral virtue, a disposition to act in accord with one's moral ideals or principles, a willingness to risk one's self-interest for the sake of one's moral values, and a tendency to be inspiring to others and thereby to move them to moral action. Please bear with me for one moment while I analyze these 5 criteria, for they are typical of criteria used in other exemplar researches. I see here 3 types of criteria, 1, 2, and 3. Let me just remove the book cover so that I can explain which types of criteria we see here. And this is a typology that I created. The first type of criteria is descriptive. It refers to qualities or characteristics of the exemplar. The second type is performative, and it refers to exemplary actions. And the third type I call impactive, and it refers to the effect that the exemplar has on other people. While several researchers have been done on moral exemplars, no research has been done so far on spiritual exemplars. Nevertheless, with regards to the nomination of spiritual exemplars, there is precedence, which is the list of 100 most spiritually influential living people published every January by the Watkins Mind, Body, Spirit magazine. About the criteria used to compile this list, the main ones are 1. The person has to be alive as of the date of the publication. The person has to have made a unique spiritual contribution on a global scale, and the person is talked about throughout the internet. Please note that these three criteria fit very nicely the typology that I suggested: descriptive, performative, and impactive. I decided I'd like to try a completely different approach to exemplar nomination. Rather than formulate the criteria first and select exemplars based on them then, later, nominate first and formulate the criteria later. Inductive rather than deductive approach. When I designed the methodology, I made two assumptions. One is that I'd end up with a list of exemplars that would have significant overlap with the Watkins magazine list, which means I would get a list of mostly of well-known exemplars. And two, that the criteria I'll end up with will be somewhat similar to those I found in the research of moral exemplars, which means descriptive, performative, and impactive. Well, it turned out I was wrong on both accounts. But before I get there, a little about the procedure. So, for nominating exemplars, I created two sets of nominators. The first set I created at the very beginning of the research process, and it consisted of 77 experts in the religious and spiritual field, whom I asked to first nominate 2 or 3 people that they considered spiritual exemplars, and then explain what it was that made those people exemplary. The second set I created halfway through the research process, and it consisted of co-researchers who watched the interviews I did with different spiritual exemplars, and then selected their 2 or 3 exemplary exemplars. To create the first set, I sent emails to 300 experts in the spiritual religious field from all over the world. In the email, I described to them the study, saying that it would focus on individuals who are perceived as exemplars of the religious or spiritual path, whom I referred to as spiritual exemplars. Then I asked them to do the following. 1. Name 2 or 3 spiritual exemplars they knew, at least one of whom is currently alive. 2. Describe each of these people, specifically indicating what it was that made each of them exemplary. And 3. Indicate their acquaintance with each of them. I asked them also to answer some questions about themselves, and here are a little bit of that information. So of the 300 potential nominators I wrote to, 77 replied. They described for me nearly 200 spiritual exemplars that they knew to some degree, of whom 74 are currently alive. Those 74 are the population on which I later conducted the main body of the research. About a third of the nominators were scholars, a third were authority figures in the religious spiritual field, and about a third of them described themselves as long-time spiritual seekers or practitioners. The duration of their involvement in the religious spiritual field averaged 38 years. I'm going to move now to the content of what those 77 nominators sent me. However, since I haven't finished analyzing their descriptions of the 200 exemplars, it will be anecdotal rather than analytical presentation. But just a very basic analysis of the 74 living exemplars that were nominated revealed that the first of my assumptions was wrong. Of the list of 100 most spiritually influential living people, compiled by the Watkins magazine, only 14 were included in the expert nominations. Most of the exemplars nominated by the expert nominators were not first or second tier exemplars, but rather third and fourth tier ones. Some of them were pretty or even completely unknown to the general public. Why is that, you may be wondering, as I did? Well, I started receiving the answer in some of the notes that these nominators wrote about their choices, and here are some of them. Nominator 345, who is the founder of an international peace initiative of women, wrote, "Through my work in the religious spiritual world, I have come in contact with hundreds of spiritual teachers and continue to seek out those who I consider to be spiritual exemplars. Among the many now presenting themselves as teachers, there are only a few who really rise above the crowd, and most often they are not the popular leaders with large followings." Nominator 131, who is the president of a UN-affiliated peace organization, wrote, "There are fully realized individuals exemplifying the unity of being and consciousness which we call God. They are one with all. I have met two men who have attained that," and then he went on and described over 8 pages those two men, and he added, "Then there are people who fearlessly devote their life in service for peace. I'm a senior advisor and a representative to the UN of the World Summit of Nobel Peace Laureates, so I'm close friends with many peace laureates. Amongst the group, there are exemplars of peacemaking, but that is not the same as being fully realized." A very interesting reply was the following from a Muslim Sufi minister and a popular speaker on interfaith relations who wrote, "The person I value the most as a living spiritual being is my sister. The other is my father, who passed away in 1990. Naturally, I am biased because they are family members. However, the same names come up when I do my utmost to be as humanly objective as possible." Now, this man knows, through interviews he did and panels he participated in, dozens of spiritual and religious leaders and teachers. Still, as he wrote, the names that came up for him when he thought of his spiritual exemplars were those of his sister and father. And here's another one that is very interesting because it contrasts the so-called objective criteria with subjective ones. So nominator 310, "I regard this woman as the most enlightened being actually living on this planet. I could bring up many reasons, listing all her extraordinary achievements in areas of charity and helping the poor, her extraordinary capacity to sit for days mostly without breaks, but for me personally, these astonishing accomplishments are secondary. What I feel, without being able to objectively prove it, is that her presence in my life has changed me for the better, making me more caring, loving toward others, conscious and open for the divine. When I'm physically next to her, I feel elevated and blissful. I feel extremely blessed to have met her." I'm going to fast forward now to a year and a half later in the research process, to a point in which I had already interviewed 18 exemplars and started to do thematic analysis of the interviews with them. At that point, I decided that I would try to create a small focus group of people who would watch the interviews and discuss their impressions with me. So I put a message in Facebook inviting people to join a small team of research collaborators who would watch the interviews and discuss their impressions of the different exemplars, and wrote the following: "Suitable candidates should have experience in qualitative research and in the psychological spiritual field who can commit to 6 hours a week for the next months." To my joy and surprise, I ended up with 14 people who committed to participating in the process for 2.5 months and then for another 2.5 months period. They watched and analyzed 1 or 2 interviews every week, and we met in 2 groups every other week to discuss their impressions. Just to give you a quick idea of the demographics of those 14 people, the mean age was 58 and all were Westerners. Now, just a month ago, at the beginning of May, we completed the process with meetings in which I asked them to nominate their most exemplary exemplars out of the 20 and something exemplars they watched and explain their choice. This is now coming a short clip with a few excerpts from one of those meetings. So we move on to what is a spiritual exemplar for me? And I think that to make that very pointed, concise, and uncompromising, I would ask each of you to choose, and I know this is not going to be easy, the 3 people that are your spiritual exemplars out of the 20, whatever, or however many. And yes, please take a minute and think who are the, well, 2 or 3 people that if you were pressed against the wall and had, as you are now, and had to choose 2, 3 people as your most exemplary exemplars, who would they be? But just for now, if each of you could say, tell us about the choosing process. So what, if you look at what went through your mind as you chose those 3 individuals, and also if you considered somebody and then decided to not include them, so why was that? So that would be a very alive, real-time kind of what is a spiritual exemplar for you now at 1 minute to 7 my time.
So just now I went by what came up first, and both times, and actually other times when I thought about, first was Vigdis, and it's about how something in her presence, which is so present moment by moment, and my sense is that's all that it is. And there's a quality, I will call it light, that if my sense of it is very profound, and that she stayed with me as I walked, as I thought, as I felt into things. So my felt sense is very much a guide, because I have some others that I hold as exemplars, but I didn't get a gut felt feeling that said yes.
Because I'm actually thinking of writing a paper about what is a spiritual exemplar. And one of the ideas I want to explore in that paper is the idea that we choose our spiritual exemplars completely intuitively and then rationalize our choices.
I think the exercise we just went through was an example of that. That's what I experienced in myself.
How so?
I hadn't thought, why did I choose these people, other than they moved me. And what does move me mean in this case? They changed my identification, or my connection to my identification with my thoughts, my opinions, my preferences, etc. So that when I say they moved me, I mean they did. I experienced an expansion, and I would say an elevation in my conscious awareness. Mm-hmm. So that was that was the general across the board. But then to each one, I felt like I needed, and I did. I mean, it wasn't that it wasn't accurate according to my mind when I had to go through the process, but it was as though I need to justify this, and each one had a different sense. And I mean, I would stand by what I said, but there was also a sense of, this is definitely an afterthought. This comes afterwards. It's not the driving essence of what happened with me, with these people, that made it such that I call this one an exemplar for me.
I'd like to conclude my presentation with a few words about first my second assumption, and in what it turned out to be wrong. To remind you, that assumption was that the criteria I'll end up with would be quite similar to what I found in previous researches of moral exemplars, that is, descriptive, performative, and impactive criteria. Well, it seems that what many of the nominators in both sets were saying was, there is something about this person that I cannot describe, but that's what makes him or her a spiritual exemplar for me. Now, that something may be expressed in some descriptive, performative, or impactive criteria, but these are more of external manifestations of that elusive something. That something itself seems to be undescribable. Secondly, I'd like to leave you with a suggestion that the results we get, both in terms of who the exemplars are and what characterizes them, may be very different if we start from a set of predefined criteria and then select exemplars based on those criteria, versus if we start from intuitively selecting our exemplars and then trying to understand why we selected them. I think it would be good to test this hypothesis that a difference in the methodology yields quite different results in further future research. Thank you.